At exactly 11:47 p.m. on October 12, 2007, security cameras captured 22-year-old nursing student Emily Fitzgerald walking out of a gas station into the Arkansas darkness. She wasn't running, she wasn't being chased. She simply stepped outside for what should have been a quick cigarette break. But Emily never came back inside. Her purse remained on the counter, her Diet Coke still cold, and her entire future waiting on hold. For 9 agonizing years, her family searched for answers while 2 men in their own community lived with a deadly secret. They attended the search parties, they comforted Emily's mother, and they watched as investigators chased dead ends, all while knowing exactly where Emily's body was buried. If you're ready for a case that proves the most dangerous predators are often hiding in plain sight, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. This story will change how you see small-town trust forever. Because sometimes, the people helping you search are the same ones who committed the crime. Fort Smith, Arkansas in October 2007 was the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked and knew their neighbors by name. Route 271 stretched through the heart of this small community like a concrete lifeline, connecting farming towns and truck stops to the rest of America. The Gas and Go station sat at the intersection of nowhere and everywhere, a beacon of fluorescent light in an ocean of Arkansas's darkness. Emily Elizabeth Fitzgerald had been working the graveyard shift at this very station for 8 months, saving every dollar she could for nursing school at the community college 15 miles north. At 22, she embodied everything good about small-town values: hardworking, responsible, and driven by dreams that stretched far beyond the city limits of Fort Smith. She was the kind of young woman who called her mother every Sunday, who remembered coworkers' birthdays, and who treated every customer with genuine kindness. That Friday night started like hundreds of others. Emily clocked in at 11 p.m., taking over from her manager Doyle McLeod, a heavy-set man who perpetually smelled of cigarette smoke and bitter coffee. By midnight, Doyle was gone, leaving Emily alone for the overnight shift, standard protocol for a station that rarely saw trouble after the bars closed. The Gas and Go had 2 security cameras, one pointed at the register to catch potential robberies, another focused on the front door to monitor customer traffic. Both were recording that night, capturing grainy black and white footage that would later be analyzed frame by investigators desperate for clues. The video quality was typical of 2007 technology: low resolution, poor lighting, and just clear enough to document tragedy without revealing its secrets. The last confirmed customer was Gerald Walsh, a long-haul trucker hauling auto parts from Little Rock to Oklahoma City. He paid cash for diesel fuel and a pack of Marlboro Reds at 11:32 p.m., making small talk with Emily about the unusually cold October weather. Walsh would later tell investigators that Emily seemed tired but normal, maybe a little quieter than usual, but nothing that raised any red flags. He remembered her smile when she handed him his change, a detail that stuck with him, because his own daughter was studying biology at Arkansas State, and something about Emily's wary politeness reminded him of his child working late, night jobs to pay for college. After Walsh left, the station fell into the familiar rhythm of overnight retail: the hum of fluorescent lights, the distant rumble of 18-wheelers on the interstate, and the occasional ding of the motion sensor as late-night travelers stopped for gas and energy drinks. Emily passed the time reading a romance novel she'd borrowed from her mother, sipping on a Diet Coke that she'd bought during her dinner break, and texting with friends about weekend plans that would never happen. At 11:47 p.m., something changed. The front door camera captured Emily stepping outside, but she wasn't responding to a customer or checking on anything specific. She simply walked out, leaving her purse on the counter beside the register, her cell phone, a silver Motorola Razr that everyone carried in 2007, lying face up next to her half-empty soda can. The motion sensor bell chimed as she exited, a sound that would later haunt her mother's dreams. The security footage shows Emily moving with purpose toward the edge of the camera's range, toward the parking lot where the overhead lights didn't quite reach the shadows. She appeared to be walking toward someone or something just outside the frame, but whatever drew her attention remained invisible to the recording equipment. The timestamp read 11:07:23 p.m. when Emily disappeared from view. She would never be seen alive again. When the next shift worker, 19-year-old Marcus Tanaka, arrived at 6 a.m. the following morning, he found a scene that made no sense. The front door was unlocked, the lights were on, and everything appeared normal except for one crucial detail: Emily was gone. The register remained untouched with $87 still in the drawer, ruling out robbery as a motive. Her purse sat exactly where she'd left it, containing her keys, student ID, debit card, and a folded photograph of her younger brother Christopher at his high school graduation. The most puzzling aspect was how ordinary everything looked. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned displays, no indication that anything violent had occurred inside the building. It was as if Emily had simply evaporated, leaving behind only the physical evidence of a life interrupted mid-sentence. Tanaka called his manager first, then the police. By 7 a.m., yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the cold morning wind as deputies from the Fort Smith Sheriff's Department tried to make sense of the impossible. Highway traffic continued to flow past the station. 18-wheelers and commuter cars whose drivers remained oblivious to the fact that a young woman had vanished from this exact location just hours before. The Gas and Go occupied a uniquely isolated position in the local geography. Surrounded by empty fields and an abandoned tire warehouse, the nearest residence was a quarter-mile away down a gravel access road. No one had seen anything unusual. No one had heard any screams or sounds of struggle. Emily Fitzgerald had simply stepped out of the light and into a darkness that would swallow her completely. The investigation into Emily's disappearance began within hours, led by Sheriff Tom Greco, a veteran lawman with salt and pepper hair and eyes that had seen too much human cruelty over 3 decades in law enforcement. Greco had worked missing persons cases before, but never one that felt so deliberately orchestrated, so carefully planned that it left virtually no evidence behind. The first 24 hours were critical. K-9 units from the state police arrived by afternoon, their German shepherds straining against leashes as handlers led them in expanding circles around the property. The dogs picked up Emily's scent near the front door, tracked it toward the eastern edge of the parking lot, and then lost it completely near a patch of gravel where tire tracks crisscrossed in chaotic patterns. The lead handler, a woman named Rivera with 20 years of experience, shook her head in frustration and told Greco that the scent trail simply vanished, as if Emily had been lifted into the air. Emily's mother, Patricia Fitzgerald, arrived at the sheriff's office by mid-afternoon, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold the recent photograph she'd brought for the search teams. Patricia was a registered nurse at Fort Smith Regional Hospital, a single mother who had raised 2 children alone after her husband died in a construction accident in 1998. She sat across from Greco's desk and asked the question every parent asks in these nightmarish moments: "Where is my daughter?" Greco didn't have answers, only questions that revealed how little they knew about Emily's final hours. Did she have a boyfriend? Had she seemed upset or worried lately? Was there anyone who might want to hurt her? Patricia answered each inquiry with growing desperation. Yes, Emily had dated Kyle Hoffman, but they'd broken up 2 months earlier. No, Emily hadn't seemed depressed or suicidal, stressed about midterms and money, but not dangerously so, and absolutely not. There was no one who would want to harm her daughter, who was quiet, responsible, and focused entirely on her studies and work. Kyle Hoffman became the first suspect by default. At 24, he worked at an auto repair shop and had the kind of face that looked guilty even when discussing the weather. When deputies brought him in for questioning, Kyle's story revealed the complex emotions of a young man who hadn't fully accepted that his relationship was over. He admitted to driving past the Gas and Go occasionally after their breakup, not to harass Emily but just to see if she was okay, just to catch a glimpse of the life that had moved on without him. Kyle's alibi was weak but consistent. He'd been home alone watching the Arkansas Razorbacks game on television, no witnesses to verify his whereabouts during the crucial hours when Emily vanished. Deputies kept him at the station for 3 hours, asking the same questions in different ways, watching for contradictions or tells that might indicate deception. But Kyle never wavered from his story, and while he seemed hurt and confused, he didn't seem like a killer. The search expanded throughout the weekend. More than 60 volunteers gathered at the Fort Smith Community Center, organizing into teams that combed the fields surrounding Route 271. They found the detritus of rural life, rusted car parts, discarded beer cans, a child's sneaker half buried in mud, but no trace of Emily Fitzgerald. As daylight faded on Sunday evening, the volunteer effort began to fragment, with many participants returning to jobs and responsibilities, leaving behind only the most dedicated searchers and Emily's family. It was on Sunday night that Emily's cell phone registered its final signal. At 11:53 p.m., exactly 24 hours after she'd walked out of the Gas and Go, her phone pinged off a tower near the Riverside Industrial Park, a sprawling complex of abandoned warehouses 3 miles south of the gas station. The ping lasted only seconds before the phone went dead permanently. But it gave investigators their first real lead in a case that had produced nothing but dead ends. The Riverside Industrial Park told the story of economic decline that had affected much of rural Arkansas. Built in the 1980s during a brief manufacturing boom, the complex now stood largely empty, its buildings covered in graffiti and surrounded by chain-link fences that had been cut and recut by trespassers over the years. When deputies arrived at dawn Monday morning, they found a maze of crumbling concrete and broken windows that offered countless hiding places for evidence or bodies. The search of the industrial park took 3 days and involved every available resource from the sheriff's department. They found oil stains and shattered glass, bird nests and the skeletal remains of small animals, but nothing that connected to Emily's disappearance. The abandoned buildings echoed with the sounds of boots on concrete and voices calling Emily's name, but the silence that answered back felt permanent and absolute. Meanwhile, a different kind of investigation was taking place behind the scenes. Detective Ray Martinez, Greco's most experienced investigator, was building a timeline of Emily's final weeks, looking for patterns or relationships that might explain her disappearance. What he found in Emily's email accounts and text message records would eventually crack the case wide open, but in October 2007, the technology to fully analyze digital communications was still evolving. Emily's laptop, recovered from her bedroom, contained months of correspondence that painted a complex picture of a young woman trying to balance school, work, and relationships while planning for a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. There were study group emails, work schedule confirmations, and casual conversations with friends, all the digital debris of a normal college student's life. But buried among the routine communications were exchanges that suggested Emily had been involved in something secretive, something that required careful planning and absolute discretion. The most intriguing discovery was a folder of emails labeled simply with the initial J. The messages spanned from June 2007 to just days before Emily's disappearance, revealing a relationship that was clearly romantic but also clearly hidden. The sender used a generic email address that couldn't be traced to any known individual, and Emily's responses had been deleted from her sent folder, a level of operational security that seemed far beyond what a 22-year-old college student would typically employ. Detective Martinez knew he was looking at evidence of an affair, but with who? And why had Emily been so careful to conceal her digital tracks? The answers to those questions were locked in computers and phone records that would take months to properly analyze. But Martinez had the uncomfortable feeling that Emily's killer was someone who understood technology, someone who knew how to cover their digital footprints, someone who had been planning this crime for much longer than anyone realized. The investigation into Emily Fitzgerald's disappearance consumed the Fort Smith Sheriff's Department for months. But by the spring of 2008, the case had grown cold despite hundreds of tips and dozens of interviews. Sheriff Greco had done everything within his power. He'd coordinated with state and federal agencies, authorized expensive forensic testing, and personally reviewed every piece of evidence multiple times. But without a body, without witnesses, and without a clear suspect, the case gradually shifted from active investigation to cold case file. In February 2008, a heart attack forced Greco into retirement, and his replacement, Sheriff Vincent Torres, made the difficult decision to declare the Fitzgerald case inactive. Not closed, Torres was careful to make that distinction, but inactive, with resources redirected to current crimes that demanded immediate attention. The decision devastated Patricia Fitzgerald, who had spent every day for 4 months believing that the next phone call might bring news of her daughter. What nobody knew was that 2 men in Fort Smith were watching the investigation with intense interest, not because they wanted to help solve the case, but because they had orchestrated Emily's disappearance and were carefully monitoring how close investigators came to the truth. Richard Lamoyne and Marcus Sullivan had known each other since high school, bonded by shared secrets and a mutual understanding that some truths were too dangerous to ever speak aloud. Lamoyne was 38 years old in 2007, married with 2 young children, working as fleet operations manager for Riverside Freight Solutions, a trucking logistics company headquartered in the same industrial park where Emily's phone had sent its final signal. His job gave him detailed knowledge of traffic patterns along Route 2R71, including which businesses stayed open late and which employees worked alone during vulnerable overnight hours. He knew about the Gas and Go's staffing schedule, knew when Emily worked by herself, knew exactly when and where she would be most isolated. The affair had begun in June 2007 when Lamoyne, coordinating a late freight delivery, had stopped at the Gas and Go for coffee and noticed Emily behind the counter. Something about her combination of youth and wariness, her polite professionalism mixed with barely concealed dreams of escape from small-town life, had triggered an obsession that would ultimately cost Emily her life. Lamoyne was skilled at psychological manipulation, understanding instinctively how to present himself as sophisticated and worldly to a young woman who felt trapped by circumstance. The relationship escalated quickly from casual flirtation to explicit emails to afternoon meetings at cheap motels along Interstate 540. Lamoyne convinced Emily that what they shared was love, not exploitation, and that their age difference and his marital status were obstacles that could be overcome with time and patience. He paid for everything: motel rooms, dinners, small gifts, creating a sense of financial dependency that made Emily feel obligated to continue the relationship, even as she began to recognize its fundamental wrongness. Marcus Sullivan's role was more complex and, in many ways, more sinister. As Lamoyne's oldest friend and frequent drinking companion, Sullivan knew about the affair from its beginning and actively encouraged it. Sullivan was divorced, bitter, and increasingly convinced that women were fundamentally untrustworthy. He viewed Emily as a gold digger who was manipulating his friend, and when Emily began pulling away from the relationship in September 2007, Sullivan convinced Lamoyne that she needed to be taught a lesson about loyalty and respect. The plan they developed was not originally intended to be murder. Sullivan later claimed they had only wanted to frighten Emily, to make her understand the consequences of trying to end their arrangement on her terms. But both men had criminal minds that operated on the assumption that violence was an acceptable solution to relationship problems, and both had enough knowledge of police procedures to believe they could commit a crime and avoid detection. On October 12, 2007, Lamoyne had called Emily during her shift at the Gas and Go, telling her he needed to see her urgently, that there was something important they needed to discuss about their relationship. Emily, who had been trying to end their involvement for weeks, agreed to meet him in the parking lot during her break, hoping to finally resolve the situation that had been causing her increasing anxiety and guilt. Sullivan was waiting in his own vehicle, parked in the shadows near the abandoned buildings of the industrial park, ready to provide backup if Lamoyne needed help controlling the situation. When Emily walked out of the Gas and Go at 11:47 p.m., she believed she was meeting with someone who cared about her, someone who would accept her decision to end their relationship and allow her to move forward with her life. Instead, she encountered 2 men who had decided that her autonomy was less important than their need to maintain control. The actual murder, according to Lamoyne's eventual confession, happened quickly and without the elaborate planning that investigators had assumed. Emily had been firm in her decision to end the relationship, and when Lamoyne became aggressive, she had tried to walk back to the safety of the gas station. Lamoyne grabbed her arm, she pulled away, and in the struggle that followed, Emily's head struck the edge of his car door with enough force to fracture her skull and cause immediate death. Both men panicked initially, but Sullivan's knowledge of police procedures, gained through years of watching crime shows and reading true crime books, helped them develop a plan for disposing of the body and covering their tracks. They drove Emily's body to the abandoned warehouse complex where Sullivan worked occasionally as a maintenance contractor, buried her in a shallow grave behind one of the buildings, and then spent the next several hours cleaning Lamoyne's car and constructing alibis that would withstand police scrutiny. The most diabolical aspect of their cover-up was Sullivan's decision to present himself as a witness to Emily's disappearance. 3 days after the murder, he contacted the sheriff's department and reported seeing a suspicious dark sedan in the gas and go parking lot around midnight on October 12. The fictional vehicle he described was generic enough to avoid specific identification but detailed enough to sound credible, and his role as a concerned citizen reporting potential evidence helped deflect any suspicion that might have focused on him or his friend. For 9 years, both men lived with their secret, watching as Emily's family suffered through anniversaries and holidays marked by absence and uncertainty. They attended community gatherings where Emily's disappearance was discussed, expressed sympathy for Patricia Fitzgerald's loss, and even participated in memorial services held on the anniversary of Emily's vanishing. The psychological toll of maintaining this deception began to manifest in both men's behavior. Lamoyne's marriage deteriorated and ended in divorce, while Sullivan became increasingly isolated and prone to heavy drinking. But secrets have their own weight, and time has a way of exposing even the most carefully constructed lies. By 2016, advances in DNA technology and digital forensics had created new possibilities for solving cold cases, and the Fort Smith Sheriff's Department had begun systematically reviewing unsolved crimes with fresh analytical tools. When Emily's case file was reopened, it contained evidence that had been impossible to properly analyze in 2007, but could now reveal secrets that had been hidden for nearly a decade. Christmas morning 2012 marked 5 years since Emily Fitzgerald had vanished from the Gas and Go, and Patricia Fitzgerald was spending another holiday staring at an empty chair at her kitchen table. Her son Christopher had come home from college in Missouri, but the celebration felt hollow, marked by the absence that had defined every family gathering since October 2007. It was Christopher who suggested they clean out Emily's old bedroom, not to erase her memory but to transform the space into something less painful, less like a shrine to interrupted dreams. Among Emily's belongings, they found her old desktop computer, a bulky Dell Tower from 2005 that had been replaced by a laptop during her sophomore year. Christopher connected it in the living room, more from curiosity than hope, expecting to find old school papers and photos from high school. What he discovered instead was an inbox that hadn't been opened since September 2007, containing emails that would resurrect a case everyone had assumed was unsolvable. The folder labeled J contained 43 emails spanning from June to October 2007, revealing the secret relationship that had cost Emily her life. The messages told the story of a young woman being groomed by an older man who used psychological manipulation and financial control to maintain power over her. They also revealed Emily's growing fear and her desperate attempts to escape a situation that had spiraled beyond her control. Christopher printed every email and drove them to the sheriff's office the next morning. Sheriff Torres, still in charge 5 years after taking over from Greco, read through the correspondence with growing amazement. The emails provided the motive that had been missing from the original investigation, but more importantly, they offered digital breadcrumbs that modern forensic technology could follow back to their source. The Yahoo account used by Jay had been created with obviously false information, but forensic analysts could trace its access points through IP addresses and digital fingerprints that had been impossible to track in 2007. Most of the account access had occurred from public computers at the Fort Smith Library and a coffee shop on Garrison Avenue, but one IP address traced back to Riverside Freight Solutions, the same industrial park where Emily's phone had sent its final signal. The company's owner, Douglas Vargas, cooperated fully with the investigation, providing access logs and employee records that identified Richard Lamoyne as the most likely suspect. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Lamoyne had worked evening shifts that matched the timing of the emails, had requested emergency leave immediately after Emily's disappearance, and had left the company abruptly in March 2008, citing personal reasons that he never fully explained to his former employer. Finding Lamoyne took months of detective work. He had effectively disappeared after leaving Riverside Freight, working odd jobs under different names, and avoiding any official employment that would create a paper trail. When investigators finally located him in February 2013, he was living in a single, wide trailer on a gravel road outside Fort Smith, divorced and isolated, surviving on cash payments for manual labor that kept him below the radar of official scrutiny. The confrontation was anticlimactic. When Sheriff Torres and his deputies arrived at the trailer, Lamoyne was sitting on his front steps smoking a cigarette, staring at nothing. He looked up as they approached, and Torres saw something in his eyes that suggested he had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. The arrest was quiet, almost peaceful, as if Lamoyne was relieved that the weight of his secret was finally being lifted from his shoulders. But the case wasn't solved yet. Without a body, without physical evidence connecting Lamoyne to Emily's disappearance, prosecutors needed more than emails and circumstantial connections. The breakthrough came from evidence that had been sitting in a storage box for 6 years, waiting for technology to advance enough to reveal its secrets. Among the items collected from the Riverside Industrial Park in 2007 was a woman's white cardigan, size small, found draped over a rusted oil drum behind one of the abandoned warehouses. At the time, investigators had photographed and cataloged the garment but hadn't performed DNA analysis because the technology was expensive and the connection to Emily's case was unclear. By 2016, DNA testing had become faster, cheaper, and more sophisticated, and the national database had expanded to include millions of genetic profiles from individuals arrested for various crimes. The cardigan yielded 2 DNA profiles. One belonged to Emily Fitzgerald, confirmed through comparison with samples provided by her family in 2007. The second profile was male, unknown at the time of initial testing, but when run through the expanded criminal database, it matched Richard Lamoyne, whose genetic information had been entered following a DUI arrest in 2014. The DNA evidence connected Lamoyne to Emily and placed him at the location where her phone had sent its final signal. Combined with the email correspondence and his suspicious behavior following Emily's disappearance, prosecutors finally had enough evidence to file murder charges. But Lamoyne's arrest revealed an even more disturbing truth about the case: he hadn't acted alone. During interrogation, faced with overwhelming evidence and the possibility of a death sentence, Lamoyne began to cooperate with investigators. He revealed that Marcus Sullivan had not only helped plan Emily's murder but had actively participated in covering up the crime. Sullivan had helped dispose of Emily's body, had cleaned the crime scene, and had deliberately provided false witness testimony to misdirect the investigation. Sullivan's arrest followed quickly, and when confronted with Lamoyne's confession, he also agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. The two men led investigators to Emily's burial site in the woods behind the industrial park, where her remains had lain undisturbed for over 8 years, marked only by a stack of 3 flat stones that Lamoyne had arranged as a private memorial to his victim. The recovery of Emily's body in May 2016 brought closure to Patricia Fitzgerald's 9-year nightmare, but it also revealed the full scope of the betrayal that had devastated her family. The men who had killed her daughter were not strangers or drifters passing through town. They were members of her own community, who had participated in search efforts, had expressed sympathy for her loss, and had lived normal lives while knowing exactly what had happened to Emily. The trial proceedings were swift once both men agreed to plea bargains. Lamoyne received 40 years in prison without possibility of parole for second-degree murder, while Sullivan was sentenced to 20 years for his role as an accessory and for obstruction of justice. Both men were led from the courthouse in shackles, their futures reduced to concrete cells and decades of contemplating the consequences of their choices. Patricia Fitzgerald attended every day of the legal proceedings, sitting in the front row as a silent witness to justice finally being served. When asked by reporters how she felt about the resolution of her daughter's case, she said simply that she was grateful Emily could finally rest in peace, but that no sentence could restore the years of uncertainty and pain that had defined her family's life since October 2007. The case officially closed on April 3, 2017, nearly 10 years after Emily Fitzgerald walked out of the Gas and Go for the last time. Sheriff Torres held a press conference emphasizing that advances in technology had made it possible to solve cases that had seemed hopeless, and that families should never give up hope that justice might eventually prevail. Emily was laid to rest in Fort Smith Cemetery on a spring morning when the dogwood trees were in bloom, and the air carried the promise of renewal. Her gravestone bears a simple inscription, "Beloved daughter and sister, her dreams live on." Patricia Fitzgerald visits the grave every Sunday, bringing fresh flowers and spending time telling Emily about family news and community changes, maintaining a conversation that death interrupted but never fully ended. The Gas and Go still operates along Route 271, serving travelers and local residents under new ownership and with updated security systems. But late at night, when the fluorescent lights buzz with electric persistence and the highway stretches empty into Arkansas's darkness, some people still think about the young woman who stepped outside for a cigarette break and never came home. And they remember that evil sometimes wears familiar faces and hides behind the mask of friendship and community trust.